Speaker is Dave Weinstein, and he's going to talk about what to look for in a manager as well as pottery. So this should be a fascinating talk. Just a reminder, also, we have 2 tracks running. There's another track running in track 2 as well, so check out our schedule. Dave, away to you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, if I did this right, I unmuted. If not, someone will tell me something. So this is a talk on 2 subjects, what to look for in a manager and pottery. These are subjects that I am both very enthusiastic about, and I'm knowledgeable in one of them, which is a solid C for those of you who are keeping score. All right, let's see. I started my career in tech at the end of February in 1988, so just shy of 34 years. For those of you watching live and in the Slack channel, please don't tell me your age or worse lack thereof in the early part of 1988. It will just make me feel sad. I've worked across the industry in companies as small as 3 and in companies with over 100,000 full-time employees, and that's before you get to the contingent staff they add on. I've been an IC, I've been a manager, I've worked in mainframes, or I like to call them Cloud 1.0, phones, handheld games, console games, library automation, academic research. I started my career in military research. I've seen a lot over the time that I've been there. And as part of this, I was first a manager in the early part of this century. And a lot of the examples I'm going to give later on things to avoid in a manager are red flags I was flying. I didn't really want to be managing. It was something I sort of had to do. I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't committed to becoming better at it. And when it was done, I swore that I was never going to do that again. And since I decided I was never going to be a manager again, I wanted to figure out what it was I was looking for in a manager. And that actually turned out to come in handy later when I decided that maybe one bad experience half a career ago wasn't necessarily dispositive. So the problem is, trust me, big companies care a lot about numbers. And one of the numbers they care about is what's called regretted attrition, which is a nice way of saying people who left that we would have rather had stay. And one thing that those studies show is that more than half the time that someone leaves a role or leaves a company, it's because of bad interactions with their immediate manager. Beyond that, the tone your manager sets is going to have a huge impact on your quality of life as an employee. But to the degree that there's any training in tech at all, and there isn't very much of it, it's aimed at trying to get managers to be less terrible at being managers. So the goal of this first part of the talk is how can you identify a good and a bad manager? And with the goal here being that you want to work for the former and not for the latter. So the first question is, well, how do I even identify information about my manager? And there's sort of 3 possible ways. There are references. Does someone you know and trust, have they worked with this person? Have they worked for this person especially? Will they vouch for them? Have they worked for this person more than once? Would they follow this person to another job? You can do observation. If you're looking at an internal transfer inside of a company, how does this manager interact with their team? How do they interact with other teams? Is there sort of anything you can glean about them through that? And finally, you get the interview process. Can you get information about the manager during the interview that would give you info? If you're interviewing for a role, you're probably going to be interviewing with people who are on the same team or the team that you're looking at joining. Is there any way you can sort of glean any information from them about what their manager is like without being really blunt and overt? Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because these are the same problems that companies are trying to address in the interview process. We all know that interviews are not ideal. You've got people trying to put on an idealized form of themselves, companies trying to put on an idealized form of themselves, and we're all trying to discern information in the space of a few hours on one day. So companies look at social media. You should look at social media. Companies look for references. You should look for references. Yeah, you're making a very important decision on minimal information because that's unfortunately how employment works. It's one of the reasons that you might be more inclined to follow a manager you've worked with before, or that someone you know and like will vouch for. The final thing is when it comes to the interview, the fact is that the odds are a hiring manager has done a lot more of these than you do because it's a large part of their job and they're going to be better at pulling information. And if you've interviewed any time in the past couple of decades, you've probably run into what's called behavioral questions. Can you tell me a time when this happened? Or can you give an example when? And part of the reason that people go for that is you're trying to draw out something that really happened that's more complicated that you can dive into and get more info. It also puts the interviewee in a little bit more firm ground because it's not a hypothetical, it's something they've already done. Now, whenever you ask a question, you are giving away information. So if your idea of a really cool question to ask the manager is, can you tell me a time when you had an employee who spent all their time shit posting on Reddit and watching videos on YouTube, and how you caught them and what they could have done to delay that? Probably not the question you want to ask if you actually want the job. On the other hand, an excellent question to ask right now is, can you tell me the changes you made and how you helped your team adapt and survive over the last 2 years of the pandemic? That's going to give you a lot of information about the manager's style, about how they work with their team, about what steps they're willing to take. It gives you more room to probe and ask more questions. And frankly, it's a question you should be asking at this point anyway. So it's not going to set off any red flags on their part. What follows are red flags to look at in prospective managers. So for those who don't know, the picture is of Jose Mourinho. Jose Mourinho has been an incredibly successful football manager in the top tier of the world. I could not say anything to quibble with his successes historically. He's got the silverware to back it up. That being said, if I had the skill level to play in those leagues, which I manifestly don't, and if I were not someone who started their career in 1988, which I manifestly am, I still would be very reluctant to work for him. And the reason is this quote from last year. He was asked why, after having conceded points from a winning position, that his team seemed to be losing from winning positions or conceding to ties from winning positions, when historically that hadn't been an issue for him. And his answer to an interview was, same coach, different players. More recently this week, he also made some disparaging comments about his current team. Don't work for someone whose answer to things is to throw their team publicly under the bus. At the end of the day, a lot of this stops with the manager. More importantly, you really want to avoid someone where all successes are due to managerial leadership and all failures are due to the ineptness of the team. This is a giant red flag. I would avoid these sorts of people. And I should add as a caveat that all of these tips are based on my biases and my experiences. So this is one where we're going to look at advice commonly given to managers. And the advice given to managers is you praise in public and you criticize in private. Constructive feedback. It should be noted that the business speak euphemism for telling someone what they did wrong is called constructive feedback, which implies that praise is unconstructive, which I don't particularly agree with, but leave it be for now. You want to work for people who are going to trumpet your successes to the world and give you your private feedback about where you need to improve. There is an important caveat here. There are some behaviors in the workplace that will require immediate and public criticism. Most of those are also actions or interactions that should be reported to HR, and a manager may be legally required to report to HR. But in general, you want to work for people who are proud to trumpet your successes and will coach and work with you in private to improve your weaknesses. All right, it's not a bad sign if your manager wants to be an IC in the future. There are plenty of people in this industry who have oscillated very successfully back and forth between managerial and individual contributor roles. It is a bad sign if your manager does not want to be a manager right now. And whether that's because someone had to do it, or they were most senior, or it was perceived to be the next step up on the career ladder. Anyway, these are all red flags. And as mentioned earlier, I have demonstrated this one myself in the past. Your manager needs to be as committed to growing and improving as a manager as they were to growing and improving in their technical skills as an IC. And again, it's perfectly reasonable for them to go back and forth. But if you're looking at someone who clearly does not want to be leading a team right now, you clearly don't want to be working for them. Like trust, respect is earned. And I'm not talking about, respect someone, their rights, their personhood, respect them as a person. I'm talking about respect for them in a professional sense is earned. So is trust. For managers out there, people aren't going to trust you, especially when they've been burned in the past, until you earn it. Now, this is best done through stories, and I'm going to go with one that is secondhand, because if you want me to tell my personal experiences with this, we're going to be not streaming live over the internet and probably in a bar when it's safe to meet people again. In the 90s, I was living in Virginia, working in the game industry, and the local paper was the Washington Post, and they had a, sort of a federal employment column. And in the run-up to Y2K, they've been hiring a lot of people from outside the traditional, federal government roles. And there was a lengthy column explaining to Fed managers that a lot of the people they were hiring for this were used to reaching out to their professional and peer colleagues for feedback and guidance on technical issues, and that this should not be taken as a threat or disavowal or basically flagrant opposition to the manager's authority. And I stopped, because that would never have crossed my mind. And I realized that I didn't ever want to work in an environment where that had to be said, and I didn't even realize that was a thing. So if there's a manager where all communications with other teams need to be guided through them, where all decisions, every decision has to go through the manager, that's a red flag. It's some combination of micromanagement and paranoia, and you probably want to avoid it. Come on, clicker. We're moving forward. Fine, we'll do it that way. As a manager, the behavior you walk by is the behavior you endorse. Hard rule. If you are interviewing for a role or you are observing a team and their team culture looks toxic to you, for your own sake, assume the manager condones and approves of it. That may not be true. They may not be aware of it, which is a different problem, and you would probably want to avoid that manager anyway. They may be actively trying to stop it, but the odds are they aren't. And for your own sake, you should avoid those environments. So if the team culture in the interview process or an observation looks toxic, avoid the manager. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is, should you expect your manager to be better at your job than you? So the short answer to that is no. The sort of the medium length answer is maybe if you're entry level. The longer answer is still no. But there may be some exceptions, especially when you're either being hired in to fill a role that was held by the manager, say as a TL, before they had too many responsibilities to do it, or is in their personal area of expertise. That being said, I've had some great conversations with peers and very senior managers who are hiring for teams that are in their areas of expertise, and will note that they're trying to fill job recs that they themselves never would have qualified for, because that's what they're looking for right now. As you grow in seniority in your career, you are going to be brought in as a specialist and a subject matter expert, and no, your manager is probably not better at it than you are. If you are outside of one of the core sort of disciplines, if you are being hired in as a business analyst to a team that doesn't have one, the odds are very good your manager doesn't have that expertise. Same thing for UX, same thing potentially for security. If you are the security person being brought into a team that hasn't had one, odds are your manager is not a domain expert in that area. Which brings up a question that was asked to me by one of my people at one point, which was, what actually do you do anyway? Which, fair. Managers have a set of objectives that they need to meet, and they have a set of people to meet it with. Those people are not fungible. They have their own skills, they have their own experiences, they have their own interests, professional interests, inclinations, and goals. As a manager, if you can line up a business need with something that also fits someone's personal and professional needs and lines them up for a promotion, that is a very, very good day. At the end of the day, though, there's always going to be work which is operational or toil-based that needs to get done. You need to make sure that that is not unfairly lumped on one person. You need to make sure it is distributed. You need to make sure that you are giving people the opportunity for growth, even if it isn't the optimal path for getting something done as fast as possible. Great. that's all well and good. I know somewhat what not to look for. What should I actually look for in a manager? So I'm going to flip manager advice again. I was asking when I was looking at going back into management and being a tech lead and manager, I asked several people I knew who I worked with who were TLMs on peer teams and who I respected, whether they thought it would be a good idea. And one of the best pieces of advice I got was to ask myself, if someone on your team delivers a really impactful, technically difficult, really cool piece of technology that is in your field of expertise and you could have done given the time to do it, are you going to be excited that you made that opportunity possible and take joy in their success? Or are you going to be bitter and angry that they got to do the cool thing while you got to do paperwork? Look for the manager who's going to be excited and proud that they were able to, in whatever way, help enable your success. Avoid the managers who will take credit for your work, but be happy for the ones, look for the managers who will be happy for it and proud of their aspect in making it possible. There's a quote, many of you have probably heard it. I was unable to find a source for it. Two people talking, and one says, well, what if we invest in all this expensive training for our people and they leave? And the other says, yeah, what if we don't and they stay? Even at companies that have tech budgets for training and theoretically are invested in training and conferences and the like, there can be wide differences in how much that matters from team to team. There's a lot of ability for money and priorities to move around. You want to find a manager who is absolutely on board with investing in growth of the team at all costs. They're the people who are going to get you the better skills, even though that means you might move to another team or even another role because it's the right thing to do. Not only is that good for your personal career growth, those managers also tend to attract the sorts of people you want to be working with anyway. This gives a little bit away of one of the future slides, but I was reflecting over the managers I've respected over the years and what they had in common. And I realized that all of them had one fundamental thing in common, and that was they all cared more about the people working for them as people than anything else. I have had managers say, if you're not looking for work right now because of our situation, you are crazy. I have had managers say, you should take the job because what I can offer you to stay is an insult. I have seen managers make decisions, this is an executive, make decisions for a company that cost the company money overall because the alternative would have been hurting a couple of the employees financially very significantly. For those outside the US, this is a corporate healthcare decision. These are all examples of managers I have had and respect greatly. And that's something you should look for. Look for a manager who cares more about you, the person, than you, the employee, and who is going to support you in doing what you need to do, even if it means that they have a hole in their table of organization that they need to fill, even if you are very hard to replace. You want people to know, you want a manager who is going to care about you before the job, and that's a great chance for you to also excel as an individual. The original outline for this talk had a bunch more slides, but I realized they all came down to this. And this is where I have to call out my biases. There are a number of different styles of management. The one that I prefer to work for and try and exhibit it was called Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf. Yes, the manager has a role in helping set direction. Yes, the manager has a role in making sure everyone's moving in the same way, same direction. However, fundamentally, I prefer to look for managers who see their role as support, to take obstacles out of the way of the team and to support the team as needed. Sometimes this is the manager as ablative armor, keeping shit from rolling down on the team. But at the end of the day, the managers I look for are the ones who are focused less on what they can do directly and more on what they can do to enable the team to deliver what needs to be delivered. Because really, honestly, that's the biggest role I think a manager has. So as an exercise, think of the managers you have most respected and what characteristics inspired that respect. Now try and figure out how you would try and identify that in a prospective manager, because that's something that will serve you very well. More importantly, it's something that's specific to you, because what you look for in a manager may not be what I look for in a manager. All right, for those people who are looking at these slides and not looking at the video, I apologize. Everything else is going to be live video. So we're going to go off of the screen share. Pottery. A couple of disclaimers. First, I am not a skilled potter. I'm an enthusiastic potter. I enjoy it. But what I really am is someone with a tech job, which means I can buy toys. Second disclaimer, there is a lot of room for intellectual exercise in pottery. What makes up a clay, how the clay bodies are done, how that will interact in the kiln, what makes up glazes, what effects you can get, shrink rates, and everything else. I choose to interact with exactly zero of that. I buy the clay bodies already mixed, I buy the glazes already mixed, and I use kiln firing programs that an expert has already figured out how to make work. And the reason for that is I have enough other things in my life that are intellectual, and I don't need another one. I need something that is more in the physical domain, that is more sensory, that at least gets me out of my head and lets me stop thinking for a bit. So I personally like to make functional ware. Mostly it's teaware of varying qualities. So as an example, this is a gaiwan. It's a lidded cup for making tea. So you put the tea in, you have a large amount of tea relative to the amount of water, you put it in, you mix it very briefly, you tilt, and you dump. And there you pour the tea. This is a manifestly terrible gaiwan. It is badly thrown. It is badly trimmed. It is badly glazed, badly fired, and the lid is just awful. It's a good example. This gaiwan is much more recent. It is got much better throwing. It has got much better glazing. The lid actually fits, although in fairness, I don't make a lid to fit a bowl. I make a bunch of bowls and I make a bunch of lids and I see what matches. There are people who can sit down with something in mind to make and just make it. I am none of those people. There are still lots of things I would improve on this, but it's definitely something I'm reasonably proud of. This is fully fired clay. It's stoneware. The intermediate step, this may or may not turn into a French onion soup pot. I say may not because the bottom is very thin. This has been bisqued. It's been fired once. At this point, you cannot turn it back into clay. You can turn it into something to fill a hole in your driveway. The next step is to glaze it and then fire it again. At the higher temperature, it will vitrify. It gets more solid. The glaze is glass on the outside. This is what's called greenware. This, if you get it wet, just turns back into mud. All right. It has been thrown. It has been trimmed. It is ready to be bisqued. It is as bone dry as you can get in the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, it is no longer capable of having moisture evaporate from it in the ambient environment. The next step for it is in a kiln. Now, one thing to realize with pottery is that things can go wrong an incredible number of ways, which may well get demonstrated in the rest of the demo. Problem the first. You can prepare the clay poorly so that you have air pockets. You can build or hand build the clay badly, or throw the clay badly, so it's a bad pot. You can trim it badly, whether that is simply uneven or you actually put a hole in it. And we'll be doing a trimming demonstration in a little bit. It has to survive the firing without the initial firing without cracking. You have to glaze it successfully. It has to survive the glaze firing successfully without cracking or demonstrating a glaze that you really don't like, without pitting, without bubbling. And then you have to not drop it. There are an enormous number of ways for failure in the process of this. The good news is, if you're interested in InfoSec from either the offensive or defensive side, you've already accepted the risk of all the different ways things can go wrong for you. Now, there are a bunch of different approaches to pottery. I mean, at the very minimal stage, you take a lump of clay, you put it in your hand, you press the sides together to make a little pinch cup, and you put it in a fire and you have a cup. There is hand building, which can be done either sculpturally or it can be done rolling it into slabs. making it into coils and then blending those together, and there's wheel throwing. For me, I prefer wheel throwing just because it's kind of cool. One last thing, if you haven't watched it and you're interested in pottery, you'll probably enjoy the Great Pottery Throwdown. It's really interesting. They do a lot of very challenging work. You can learn a lot. The only caveat I'll make is that while the subjects they cover are fascinating to me, the actual competition itself is sort of the opposite of what I get out of ceramics, which is a chance to relax and unwind, and trying to build specific things to a specific brief under a specific time limit and then be judged would be really unpleasant. So now we get to the point of the live demo. All right, so hopefully we have now switched and you can hear me through the other microphone. So this is a Shimpo electric wheel. There are a lot of advantages to this one for people who've never done pottery before. It's a direct drive wheel and it's very quiet, which is great for me, but people who've done pottery for a long time and are used to belt-driven wheels will both expect the time it takes the belt to wind down rather than an instant response, and also will often use the sound the wheel makes as an input to what they're doing. Right now, if you were interested in doing this, the supply chain, as with everything else, is a problem. And you may be limited to what you can actually find. On top of the wheel is a tool called a Giffen grip. So traditionally, the way you would trim is that you would put the item in the center of the wheel, and you would sort of spin the wheel slowly and tap it around until it looks centered again, and then you would chuck it into place with some loose clay. This is really irritating. Or, hear me out, you can just use a tool that does it for you. So this particular piece is a little too heavy on the bottom, and of course, obviously the foot is wrong. So all I'm going to do is just take a sharp tool, and oh, we've lost a little bit of grip. I'm holding down on the top because as I put friction on it, I can pop it off because I don't want too much pressure on it. So this clay, this particular piece is what's called leather hard, which basically means you can cut it without just smushing it all to hell. The other advantage of the Giffen grip is that it's really easy to just pop it on and off again. So here, it's a lot more shaped like a cup. It's still fairly thick around the edges. There's room to either inset that foot in, and I should add, I am not great at cutting feet on these things. So we're going to do a live demo, and since I'm not great at it, I'm going to do it anyway. Because again, this is a hobby. This is something I do for fun and because I enjoy it. And I am accepting of the fact that things can go wrong. So I'm just going to blend that out a little bit. Take another tool, take the little beak end. If I were smart, I would have taken that tool off before I did it. If I were really smart, I would have not had the sharp tool sitting in the middle of the Giffen grip while I was trying to do things. That was clever. But, and here, there's a little bit of an inset there, just a little bit of a rim. That is, reasonable enough for what it is. This will shrink significantly in firing, so it's a very small teacup, but it's an adequate teacup. We can put it to the side for the moment. This particular clay, that one had a relatively small amount of clay at the bottom. This one has a very thick bottom on it. So there's more room to either trim it or destroy it. Or, both. One of the things I like about ceramics in general is that it's both additive and subtractive. You can address things by adding more clay to them. The catch is, see right there, it just popped up. The catch is that you need to, also you'll make a mess, so that's fine. The catch is that you need to have the humidity right between the pieces of clay. You don't want it to shrink. You know what? I need to use a slightly different set of chucks for this, and I don't really want to spend the time on it right now, so I'm going to put this one aside for later. Because the next part of the demo is even more fun for inspiring the wrath of the demo gods. Because I'm trying something that should theoretically work, but I haven't tried. So when throwing, you can throw directly on the wheel head. That's how I learned. We use a bat system. So there are clay discs or clay squares that go there. You throw on, you pop it out when you're done. I said I'm enthusiastic, but not particularly skilled. So I didn't want to have you watch me center clay. So yesterday, I centered some clay and put it aside in a plastic bucket. I've never tried this. In theory, this should work just fine. In theory. Everything works in theory. Also, it's not quite right, but let's see how it feels. Yeah, it's not centered, or rather the wheel slightly off-centered when I put it in, which I was kind of afraid of. So it's a piece of clay. It is kind of centered. I don't want to spend all of our time centering it. It has been compressed, so you raise it up, you push it down, you raise it up, you push it down. You're trying to get the clay compressed so that the bottom doesn't crack. If you don't compress it correctly, the bottom cracks, and then you put it back in the bin. So, wow, you are not centered. So 2 options, but I'm going to go with just get something centered quickly. So when you're opening the clay up, and I can tell by the feel that it is definitely not centered, unfortunately, but it's a demo, and I don't want to waste all your time watching this. So because it's not centered, what's going to end up happening is that the edges are not going to, you can see the center is wobbling. The edges are going to be irregularly shaped as we go. But what the hell? It's a demo. And if you're not afraid to fail, you shouldn't be doing this if you're afraid to fail, you shouldn't be doing this anyway, because the only way to get better is to try things that break. So what I'm doing here is I'm opening a hole in the center of the clay form. This often pulls something off center. So you can see it's not great. It's a bit slightly irregular there. This is a chamois cloth, just to compress the top down a little bit. And then we're just going to pull the clay up. Now, there's a lot of guidance. I have seen so many contradictory things about how to pull and how to do it. And I can tell by looking at it again, we're off center, but whatever. The great thing about this is, again, whatever doesn't work gets cut off, equalized in humidity, and then just gets blended together and used again. Anyway, there's a lot of different advice. There's tons of source material out there. There has never been a better time in the history of the human race to be self-taught at something. So again, basically all I'm doing here is I'm using the wheel itself. You can see that we're just pulling up. The clay comes up because the force of the wheel is pushing it out. I'm going to go ahead and take the sponge to the outside and help smooth it and also help me set it a little bit. Now, one thing, I'm going to slow this down. I can feel here, I don't know if you can see it, that I pulled up irregularly. So this particular section right there is actually thinner than it should be. This makes the whole thing slightly unstable. So I'm going to try and just put less pressure with my fingers as I go through that section. Again, you would take the cloth or the chamois, and you want to squeeze in there just to compress the ridge, the end. Similarly, take a sponge, compress the base. Now note that as it's spinning, that's going to push the clay out as you go. So now at the moment, this is a bowl. Also, theoretically, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you throw a cylinder first, and then you pull it out to the side. I did mention I'm not that great at this. I just enjoy it. So because this wheel goes counterclockwise, which is the Western style, you want to have your inside hand be your left hand, your outside hand be your right hand, and you want to work basically from this quadrant of the wheel. And you can see that this thing is definitely off true. Also, you can see that I knocked the sponge away. So we'll reach down and grab that. Because this is pretty much a scrap pot at this point, it's not going to work. I'm going to just go ahead and collar it in a little bit, just for fun, just to show some of the stuff you can do. Because again, I'm just putting pressure with my hand as it goes. And as I let up on the wheel, I'm going to try and get it to round out a little bit. but you can bring that in. Wow, that's not true. You can come around here, take a little bit of the slip off. See, one of the other things you can do when you start getting to the point where, wow, that top is not working, you can take a separate tool and say, huh, that part's terrible. Cut it off. Try again from down here. Is this part better? Well, a little bit. While you're putting pressure on it, there is room to do things like shape it. You can take a hand, blend it, push the outside. Again, this piece is not going well. At a given session, I can sit down and spend a couple hours, and I might get a couple pieces that I think are worth firing. And I'm pretty generous on what's worth firing. It's like if it's vaguely round shaped, I'll probably fire it. If nothing else, it's practice in trimming and glazing. And here, what's happening is, you notice how I said there was a thin spot? That's what keeps folding over when I do things. So the right answer here is literally to come beneath it with that pin tool, cut it off. Now we can then take the same tool, try and trim this outside section off where it's off, and potentially cut that away. This is the amount of clay that's already been cut off. There's a reason it starts with a bigger lump. Now, the good news is at this point, this starts looking like something that maybe could turn into a lid. It started as a bowl. It might be a lid. It might be a saucer. It might all end up in the recycler. If your goal here is that you are always going to be successful, it's a bad hobby to take up. Because even if you get to the point where there is stuff that you can reliably always deliver, if that's all you do, you never grow. You never learn anything new. I had a teacher who said basically the first point that becomes interesting is when you start going backwards. Because you are basically, if you're not going backwards, you're not pushing yourself. Keep learning new things, keep trying new things. At the end of the day, it's just fancy mud. Since I can't see the computer, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, you have about 6 more minutes or so.
Okay.
Plus
So,
questions.
I can take questions. I can also, while we're doing that, pop this off for the moment. You could maybe make something out of it, but it doesn't really look like it's going to be worth it right now. So we'll put that aside because demo prep means having another display ready. This is the other reason I like this particular system. All right. So are there any questions?
A lot of people are asking about the firing process. They want to know how much space it takes up, what you've got in your house, how you do it.
I have a fairly oversized kiln for what we do. It's 7 cubic foot cone art. You can get smaller kilns. I would recommend buying a good sized kiln because you don't want to buy more than one. Kilns generally need 18 inches of clearance from flammable objects because I am paranoid and work in security. I've got 24 inches to anything flammable. The bricks around, you can see sort of over here, is actually a brick web on the wall. So this is 1/3 thickness brick, both because I like the way it looks and because it gave a non-flammable surface around the kiln. Even though the floor in this studio is concrete, the kiln itself is actually on raised mortared down pavers, so that there is a 7 foot by 7 foot clear demarcation of nothing flammable goes here, please. This is a lot of paranoia because the controller will actually shut down if the temperature at it goes above about 180 or 190. I also have, there's a vent out of the bottom of the kiln, which goes to the outside to remove volatiles from the kiln. And the style I use, the recommendation of my local shop, which is Clay Art Center in Tacoma,
is the fan actually mounts to the wall, not to the kiln, so that if you do get a pinhole anywhere in the pipe that's going to it, it'll still keep pulling air out of the building rather than venting it in. I also have a secondary fan, which will move about 1,400 cubic feet per minute that we run when the kiln is running, mostly to keep the room from overheating. And I have an Allied fireball mounted above the kiln as active fire suppression. I might be a little paranoid on some things. It's an electric kiln in Washington State. That is a fantastic idea because electricity is cheap out here. It's got a programmable controller. So there's sort of two basic types of firing for pottery. There's oxygenated firing and reduction firing. So all electric kilns are oxygen firings because you're not actually burning anything. So there's free oxygen in the air in the kiln. And a reduction firing is something using a fuel, or it can be, where there is no oxygen available for the glazes to grab, so they'll pull things out of the clay itself. The two styles can give very different results. Beyond that, there are, for example, wood firings, which take a prolonged period of time. Usually you get people working together to do them because you've got to keep the wood going for ordered days. And the way those work is that the wood ash is what you're looking for. The ash actually, as it deposits on the clay, forms a glaze all its own. So you get an unpredictable glaze and you don't have a lot of control over it. For most people, an electric kiln is what you're going to want. Also, an electric kiln is usually about the only thing you can buy. Most people, when they're doing clay, fuel-fired, whether it's gas-fired, oil-fired, wood-fired, build the kiln themselves. Electric is a lot easier to work with. Again, basically it's a metal box with clay, and it draws a fair amount of power. You will, for any reasonable sized kiln, you will need an electrician. My kiln is on a 240 volt single phase, and it draws up to 80 amps at inrush current. So you are going to need to get it wired in. I would want to make sure, you want to be sure that you have the heat sources controlled, that you don't have anything flammable near it. Also, right now, because of the supply chain, you don't have a lot of flexibility in what kilns you can get. Timelines can be 6 to 12 months out. Talk to local suppliers. You might be able to find one used. You would want to get someone who knows what they're doing to tell you whether it's a good kiln to buy or not and how much maintenance it needs. In theory, there's a lot of maintenance you can do yourself. You can, the heating elements eventually burn out and need to get replaced. Sensors may burn out and need to get replaced. Clay brick is very fragile. The fire brick is very fragile. So my plan for this is when I need to replace the elements, I'm going to hire a professional to do it for me. This also gets back to the tech pays for hobbies way more than hobbies pay for tech. Like, this is literally the least cost-effective way to get ceramics you can think of. I could buy any pot I wanted, except maybe a Ming vase or something, for the rest of my life and not break even with what I spent getting the studio set up.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful explanation. I don't see any other questions. Does anybody else have any questions for Dave? Since I'm relaying them, since Dave's hands are currently occupied.
Yeah, this is why normally you
pottery
trim after throwing, but it's like I need to do the throwing last because at that point I need to wash my hands before I can get to that computer.
I think that's it.
All
well,
right.
Dave, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank
this
you. I will once
everything
everything gets cleaned up, I will be in the I'll be in the Slack. Again, one thing I mentioned in the abstract that I didn't really talk to, early in your career, there's a huge return on investment of like spending spare time growing your technical skills. There really is. I'm not going to lie. However, that does not stay. Once you've really got a good handle on ramping up on new technologies, you need to do something that isn't, or most people need to do something that isn't just tech. That's why you see a lot of people take up wood turning or take up pottery or take up anything that exercises a different part and lets you relax.
Totally agree. Very important. I mean, obviously, I agree. I set up this conference about it, but yeah.
But
it's a very important point.
A lot of fun. And for me, again, It's relaxing. Also, we've talked, I know there have been, the keynote talked about setting up places for people to fail. I've talked about being willing to fail in public, as witnessed these demos. It's nice having something where your failure doesn't matter. If you screw up, it's just mud. It goes back, you use it again.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you.